We have sessions each first Wednesday of each month here. So welcome, already said that. Organizers. We have Winnie, which is our head organizer. He's back there. He's our head honcho guy. Christine's not here tonight. She's our UX person. She does a lot of, like with the UXy type stuff. Satya, he's one of our architects here. He's right there. Sangeeta, she's one of our product, what do you call it? What is her role?
Scrum Master.
What's that? Scrum Master?
Yeah.
Myself, Kevin Hackey, and we have Razid here. Where'd Razid go? Back there. Okay. Sponsors, Thompson Orders, that's the facility here. They provide us with the pizza, they provide us with this auditorium, some of the door prizes. Also Handing Publication, there's a sponsor, they provide some ebooks for us to give away as door prizes. So we have two $25 gift cards, then 2 ebook vouchers from many publications for different publications they have. So Patrick Walters is our speaker tonight. He's going to be speaking on, I have the hardest time with this word, Aurelia. Are that close? Mm-hmm. Okay. So he's one of the core team members focused on something that's near and dear to my heart, which is improving the developer experience. I'm all about making things, find out how you want to do it, make it easy and repeatable so the team can just go. So I really like that he's an advocate of that. He's got a background in .NET, but focused primarily on JavaScript and Ruby Rails, things like that. And without further ado, here he is.
I'm going to switch over laptops really quick here. I was afraid the battery was going to die, so I plugged in another one. So while I'm getting that set up, I appreciate the pizza, by the way. That was really good. I haven't had Domino's in forever, and that really hit the spot. I don't know about you guys. Oh, I got to log back into Wi-Fi. So I'm going to go ahead and get started.
Before you start, just a quick one. Did you install the Camtasia?
What is it?
Camtasia?
Yeah, I got Camtasia right here.
If you can start the recording, that'll be good.
So we're going to record a session today, and I think it'll be available for everybody if you feel like that it was so great you want to go back and hear anything else again. So. Cool. Cool. So I have a presentation, and I've gone over this presentation before, so I'm going to kind of deviate from it and talk a little bit more in depth on different subjects. And along the way, I definitely encourage anyone that has a question, or if you want to talk about something or discuss an idea, I think it definitely works well for these kind of forums. I love it when people learn or bring up questions and everybody else kind of benefits from that question as well. So feel free to stop me at any point. So Aurelia, we've been working on it for about a year now, a little bit over a year under the covers, but probably about a year in the public. And the reason that we started out talking about Aurelia is not because there's problems with other frameworks or because the other things do everything wrong and we just had to find our own way, right? That's like the meme of the year is there's a new JavaScript framework this week because we needed a new solution for whatever the problem that we had was. The reason that we like to encourage Aurelia and that I encourage you to look into Aurelia is because, and this is one of the big things that we talked about, it's really focused on being more spec compliant and being more about conventional development. So if you go and you look at some of the ways that you can use JavaScript and some of the things that you have to put in your JavaScript to have it execute properly, in other frameworks, sometimes you'll see things that aren't, they're not exactly either spec compliant or they don't follow what the group that agrees on these sort of things agrees that the future of JavaScript is or the future of HTML, right? And so what ends up happening is we have to teach, we all do it, right? We've all learned a number of frameworks, and you have to go through, find out all the basics. You have to figure out how the little nuances work, how the binding system works, or how whatever problem you're trying to solve is. And if you look, we've got together a lot of these specifications for HTML and for ECMAScript, such as like the ES6 and the ES7 specs, and they're great, and they're really driving application development in the right way. The web wasn't made for HTML, and the browsers weren't really made to serve web applications, but that's where we are. Everyone carries around a cell phone, right? And so if we build things that work cross-platform and they're browser-based, then I think it empowers developers because we can learn skills that aren't just specific. So when you learn Aurelia, you don't really learn things about Aurelia that are, you don't have to get into the framework and understand what transpiling is, or a lot of the more technical things, right? How does the binding system work? How do I set it up? A lot of it is more conventionally set up so that it should follow specs. And some of those specs aren't ironed out. We were just talking earlier. So like in the binding system, we had implemented object.observe, which is the future spec that they had come up with on how to watch for changes in JavaScript. That spec went away, and we still moved on. What the developers learned wasn't how that spec is implemented, but how to build things that work within the specifications. And I think that's a big driving point for me of why I like to contribute to Aurelia and why I like to talk about it, is because really, when you go out and you write code that works in multiple frameworks, that's a win for everybody, right? If we're a team of developers and we can all look at the same code and understand it without having to get a primer on what it does, I think that's a huge win. And so that's kind of the points that I'm talking to there. Also, a big thing is right now there's a lot of possible changes out in the future of what JavaScript really is going to evolve into, right? There's a lot of unknowns, a lot of things that aren't finished being ironed out. And in the past, we've used that as the reason to not learn or expand the language or fix things, right? In the past, we said, well, this could change, so I'm not going to touch it. And if you look around in all the communities, not just in Aurelia, that's changing to say, okay, let's use it and see what we need it to do, and then we can build the specs that way. And I think that's another thing that Aurelia really promotes. And another thing is there's a lot of small modules. So if you go to our official GitHub account and you go to the organization, you'll see there's something like 34, 35 repositories that we have, and each one of those is a small piece of the overall system. And you don't have to use all of them, but if you want to take them out or replace them, it's really easy to do. So if you're more comfortable using like knockout and the knockout binding syntax, you can easily use that inside of Aurelia. There's nothing forcing you to actually use any of the modules, and they're really easy to swap out. Some of the features that we do talk a lot about is the MVVM pattern. So if you're coming from, is everybody familiar with what that acronym means? Anybody not familiar? How about that? Okay, cool. So MVVM is a pattern of a model, a view model, and a view. And the idea is, so if you look at like a traditional Angular application, you have a controller that could serve multiple views. The MVVM pattern really pushes you to have one view, like your template, which is backed by a view model, and the view model and the view talk between each other. They're bound together, and the model serves as the representation from like your database or something, right? You might have a class that's set up to represent your model. Your view model might have some business logic, and then your view is actually where we render it to the user. And we really like that because it helps to enforce convention over configuration. So by helping the developer out up front and making trivial decisions for them, you can get started and moving along quicker. You don't have to understand how everything works until you want to really get in there and configure it to work differently, if that makes sense. Also, a really big point here is everything that we do is plain JavaScript plus polyfills, and we support TypeScript, CoffeeScript, whatever other variation that you want to use. And this is really important because if you look in your JavaScript, you don't end up writing anything that's syntactically invalid or that's not the right way to write JavaScript. Everything uses, depending on which flavor you want to use, there's a way to write it, an easy way that follows the spec that you can use. And also when you look at like the HTML templates and things like that, everything is compliant back to the spec, so it's very easy to read. And I'll show you a lot of examples here in a minute. And one of the big bases for everything is custom elements. And I'm actually going to switch over and give you an idea for what a custom element looks like. So somebody give me a really, doesn't have to be super simple, but a widget you might use at work, or a widget or something that we could build just to demo it out.
I don't know, button component.
All right, a button component. I stopped Camtasia and I accidentally restarted. Cool. So, and if you guys can't see it that well, just let me know and I'll see what we can do. So if we're going to build a custom element out that's a button, a button's perfect because when you build a button, you want to have it styled the same. You want to have when it clicked, it does something. You want to be able to attach behaviors like if you're using it on a mobile and they do a slow touch, maybe a long touch does something different, right? And so if we look at what a custom element really is, let's see. Make sure we get syntax highlighting here. Go away. Going to do our button.html. And I write, we'll do source button.js. So, and we'll do everything today like an ES6, ES7, which is kind of the future, more clean class-based syntax. But everything stands true for CoffeeScript, TypeScript, or ES5. You can write it just as easily without doing anything else, without doing anything special at least, in any other flavor that you want. So, but we might have a click handler. We probably have some text that will display, and let's see. When we're looking at our button and we're building a template for it, the spec says that we should wrap everything that's going to be a template in a template tag, and that way it's more repeatable. We load it into the browser's memory once, and then the browser knows whenever I'm rendering this template, I'm going to use this HTML, this block of HTML that we're about to write. So we might do a fancy button that has a click event. And we'll render our text, right? And so if we look at this custom element, it's really super simple. But this is how I normally start out all my development with Aurelia. Is I have a need for a component that I want to build, right? I don't want to add it to a huge existing page of code that I have, and then copy all that code and go into wherever my JavaScript's located and wait for document to be ready, and then attach event handlers. And now my code's all over the place, right? I've got some HTML here, I've got JavaScript here, and just things going on all over the place. With Aurelia and with custom elements, what we try to do is we try to pair our view model to our view. So the view model says, this is a button, it describes what it is, and conventionally, we'll attach our button.js and we'll bind it up to our button.html, right? When we do that, we might want to do things like a button has a click event. And when you click on a button, the browser will always delegate or trigger an event, right? There's a difference between delegate and trigger, so let me put trigger up there. It's a little bit easier to explain. But when you trigger an event, this would be the same thing as if you went into jQuery and you said, or if you use vanilla JavaScript, it's the same thing. You attach an event handler on the trigger event, and then you fire off the JavaScript, the corresponding JavaScript. And so with custom elements, you can do this, and there's a few different ways that this could be implemented. But what you're seeing here with click.trigger is actually a valid HTML attribute. And there's nothing invalid about that code. It doesn't have to be compiled or anything else before you can actually use it, right? And with our JavaScript over here, we have just a standard class. That class has a text property, and it has a method called click. On click, we might do something, right? Console log, pass through, whatever. But what's really important to see is it's really easy to read, right? Now our component, we can reuse our button all over our application. And when we do, everyone can understand, one, where it's coming from, and two, what it does. There's not a lot of magic under the covers. what's going on here, right? I mean, I think we could all, if we walked in the room right now, look at it and go, all right, I pretty much get what's going on. And that's what we're really going for. There's, let's see. Oh, and then some interpolation. So the mustache syntax that we use is the $ with your brackets. You could use whatever syntax you wanted in there. So if you wanted to replace that with like handlebars or something, under the covers we would have to tell Aurelia to use handlebars, but then it would just, that's the only change we'd have to do, right? In our actual code, we're not going to go in and put a bunch of handlebars initializers or anything else. And so when I talk about custom elements, that's what we're trying to build, I think, is these components that are highly reusable, and they allow us to share code, and it's easy to read. I think that's a huge benefit of using Aurelia there. If I go back to PowerPoint, wrong one. Cool. And so we have a data binding system in there, right? When we looked at the syntax of actually taking our text and putting it in the right place, it's fairly easy to read and it's very fast. So one of the benefits of being a developer in 2015 and 16 is that everybody's trying to be the fastest right now. And so all the performance problems that we've had in the past are kind of moving out of the way, and we can just work on writing code instead of debugging speed. And we're no different in that regard. So we're always actively trying to make sure that we have the fastest data binding, and also to learn from everybody else, right? If somebody has something, I think all the frameworks are doing this right now, but like if Ember's working on the Glimmer engine to work on getting their templating faster, their binding engine, we're going to go and we're going to look at that and make, go, hey, you know what, they're doing some really good stuff in here. We could reuse this idea. Another big one is dependency injection. Does everybody know what I mean? Who doesn't? Who's not familiar with dependency injection? Is it pretty? Okay, cool. So with our dependency injection system, it's very nice. It's one of the things, not the only, but it's one of the pieces that's abstracted out that everybody wants to go and use in their Node application, because it's very, very nice, and it handles a lot of things in a really conventional way. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in a minute. Another thing is it's really easy to integrate third-party libraries. So if you're familiar with using a JavaScript framework, sorry, the pizza's coming back up now. If you're familiar with using like a JavaScript library that handles sorting, or one of the other million JavaScript libraries out there, it's really easy to get these things installed in your application and up and running very fast. And actually, I'll show you an example of what it would look like to do that. So if we go back to our custom element, if we wanted, in our view model here, if we wanted to, is everybody familiar with Moment.js, the time library? So everybody uses Moment, right? If we wanted to use Moment, all we'd have to do is say import Moment from then text. Say, oh, still there. Say we were going to use it to change the value of text, right? All we'd have to do is we go, so most people that are using Aurelia now like to use a tool called JSPM for their package manager. And what it does is you say JSPM install Moment. And it goes out and it'll find Moment, it'll make it available to you, and it'll also be ready to bundle up. So then all we have to do is go type import Moment from Moment, and now we have access to the Moment object. And this is really important too when you look at application development, because there's no global dependencies. There's not, I don't know if anybody else has seen this, or maybe it's just me, but a lot of times you get into the situation where this code block runs perfect as long as there's 100 other things that go in place first, right? And you end up in some other file trying to manage what loads when and making sure the dependencies are in place. And if they don't, you have some try catches or something. With the class syntax and with our import there, we establish what all of our dependencies are, and then everyone knows when they're using it what it is and where it comes from. And then when we use it, we have a reference to it too. And if you like to use TypeScript, this all works really well for your editor. Like in Sublime here, if I was doing this in TypeScript and I F12'd on moment, it would go to my moment definition and show me all the signatures of the methods. So I think that's really cool because you don't end up having to go to your index page and add the download it, put it in wherever you go to your index page, add a reference to it, and then you can use it. It's always going to be available to you. And another thing is, we're starting to get a lot of community contributions on plugins, and so I think everybody is pretty familiar with what a plugin is or what it does, right? It's something that provides some functionality, and it's supposed to just tie into what we're building. So if we look at like adding a dialog or a modal to our application, there's a 3 or 4 different dialog modal implementations that we can use, and those are all plugins with different dependencies or configuration, but it's all handled under the covers. We don't have to worry about getting it set up and everything else there. So cool. We talked about a view and a view model, and we've talked about custom elements. And custom elements, I think they're great for development, and it's kind of like what we've already looked at here. A few things that you'll see differently is not only have we built a custom element that can be used from anywhere, we've also showed the usage. So here, when we want to use our custom element, all we have to do is require it from the path to the file, and then we can just conventionally say, place my custom element here, bind the to property to the property of name, and that's it. It'll get rendered there. The view model will get bound to it, and it's. I think it's very easy to recode. And there's only 2 things that you see here that are specific. There's only 2 things that are specific to Aurelia that are what I would call like framework-related code, and that's just that we're implementing this decorator of bindable, and that here we're requiring it. So the spec for actually requiring and loading your custom elements isn't been ironed out enough yet. So we're trying to follow the spec as close as we can, but there's no. They've just recently blown the whole spec away, so that's why you see that. And these decorators, they're really nice. So has anybody seen a decorator before? Everybody seen a decorator? Okay, cool. So we got one. So decorators are a new concept that are coming in the next version of JavaScript, ES7, and they're really nice because instead of having to add a bunch of functionality to our property and our constructor, we can just, it's basically like mixing it into a class or to a property. So we can go in and say, by just adding this bindable, there's a few things that we conventionally do. We let that property, somebody can bind to it, and they can specify whether that's a one-way binding, one-time, two-way, or any other binding ways they want to, or binding methods. And it provides you a few things like a change handler. So if we added toChanged method here in our class, that would get called every time the value changes for 2. And I think that's really neat. So like if we looked at, let me show you what that looks like.
Just real quick.
Yeah, go ahead,
Is
definitely.
that decorating the class?
This one here is decorating the property. So you can have class decorators and property decorators. So this is specifically decorating that property there. If we wanted to decorate our class as like a singleton or as a transient or something, so we want to have one instance or everybody that gets it gets a new instance, we would put a class decorator right above our class that said that said at transient or at singleton. So
Are the property decorators part of the stack?
yes. Yeah. So if you go in and you look at so the person that's really driving the decorator spec 2 is actually one of the Ember contributors, Yehuda Katz, and he's got the spec is still in a rough draft form on decorators, but they're so powerful that I think it's one of the things that'll be moved up instead of moved back within it.
Aurelia's doing the translation there, or is that actually Babel that handles that?
Yeah. So you mean transpiling this to ES5?
Well, yeah, because I haven't actually seen that syntax for the decorator, so I'm curious if Babel's handling that or you guys are handling that.
It's Babel.
Okay.
So what he's talking about with transpiling is we are writing code that's that if you go launch an Internet Explorer 10, it is not going to work. You have to do this one step called transpiling, and all the projects that we make available to the public, have a step in there to make this into usable code and also serve it from the right location and everything for you. So, but there is a step that you do have to do to make this valid in the current state of browsers that don't support it, and that's where you transpile it. And basically, it'll take this class and it'll make it look like it'll make it into a JavaScript object, and it'll add these properties on the prototype, and it'll do that to the method also. It does it for you. You don't have to know how it works or why it works if you don't want to. But when you do, you can, and you can configure it. But yeah, to your point, we don't have any. The only build tooling that we actually use that is specific to Aurelia is for bundling, and that's because bundling, you can do bundling a million different ways. And actually, our build tooling for bundling, it just uses JSPM under the covers anyway. So, but so if we looked at what it would look like, so say from who's ever consuming our button, we want them to be able to bind to that value. So instead of just setting it once, we want them to be able to change the value of our button whenever they want to, right? Whenever the consumer wants to. We add that bindable decorator. We have to get it from the framework. If I can type. You always type like 10 times worse when other people are watching. Cool. So if we look at it, this binding decorator, it provides a lot of value for us because now that's all we have to do for someone else to be able to bind to our text and set it whatever they want. And then also, whenever that value changes, this method gets fired for us. So we don't have to add any special change handlers, and we also don't have to do anything to observe that property directly. We have that one little snippet that comes in from the framework, that decorator, and it just works for us. And I find this really nice for me in particular, because when I'm doing my development and if I'm reading somebody's code and it's like trying to think of the best way to put it, one event happens, then magically some method gets fired that does some other thing, and there's this whole structure that's going on, and it's hard to follow. You have to understand why things are happening. When you're using these future classes, the code is very easy to read, for one. It's well structured. I think somebody brought that up in there when they were talking about Angular 2, right? Because Angular 2 obviously uses the same ES6 classes. They're very easy to read. We know where all the methods are, and it might take you a second to figure out why text change fires when text value changes, right? That second is just reading the name of it, and it's like, oh, okay, I got it. Makes sense.
That's just convention?
Mm-hmm. This is a convention that we follow. So conventionally, with this bindable decorator, which comes from Aurelia, that's what conventionally happens. There's also a few things under the covers, but yeah.
Could you make it explicit? Could you make it call food when text changes?
Yeah, so that's the whole idea behind convention over configuration. That's a great point. Is conventionally that's how we want a bindable decorator to work. But if we wanted to change it, and if we had TypeScript on and hit it, we could go directly to the signature, but I don't right now. So at bindable, and we'll call our property text. We'll have it fire foo changed, and that's one of the signatures, I believe. And then there's also this whole idea of being able to pass in an object where we can specify what's the name of our property, what do people call it as. If they bind to it, should the binding be the actual, our property here can say, if you bind to me and you want to be two-way and I'm only a one-way binding, you can't do it. We're going to throw an error there, right? And this helps to be able to configure the property more in depth. And if I had that signature, I'd pull it up. Cheat sheet. Oh, okay. I got kicked off the internet. I don't have the password yet. I'll put it back in a second. But yeah, that's the idea behind convention over configuration. Is we want it to be simple up front and then highly configurable. Yeah.
So I guess if you have multiple bindable, like so you got a bindable text,
Mm-hmm.
and then if you decorated another property on there, like what comes as new value? Is it the whole button not rendered? Is it how does it know if you have multiple ones? Like what's the text change? Oh, text change.
Yeah. So we
I
have.
see.
Yeah, exactly. So here's what would happen. And I'm going to switch this back to our binding syntax just so it's not too confusing. But what happens is when a consumer says they want to set the text to the button, it will actually go in through the first pass, and we will bind this view model to the view, and then after that's done, we'll go find what they wanted to bind to that. We'll set those values, and at that point, so what would happen in the life cycle is we would render the DOM, and then our text property would change because it has that initial set value of foo, right? When foo fires, we'll update the DOM in the proper location where we used our interpolation there, where we just said render text, right? That's where we'll change that. And then our text change event will fire, and it'll pass in a new value for us. Does that answer your question?
I think, or you said there could also be so by convention though, there would be a food change, like if
Yep.
you wanted to make that bind.
Yeah, and so what Aurelia would do is if you change the value of foo, it'll check the context for a foo change method and fire convention there. And so that brings up a really cool point. So has anybody used like Ember or Knockout where they've used computeds? Is anybody familiar with computeds? So computeds are where you have one property that's dependent on multiple other properties, right? And there's never been a really good way. So what does that code look like? So if I was writing a text and foo return this.text plus this.foo. So if I was writing, so if I wanted this property to be bound to our DOM that said just take the two values and concatenate them and show them, right? Traditionally, what we've had to do is use this concept of computeds. And computeds are, I used to use computeds a lot, and there's nothing wrong with them, but they're very performance intensive. They will, if you use computeds all over your app in any framework, it's going to just bring you down. You're going to end up in a bad spot. And that's because they're implemented, so if you're familiar with Angular 1, they're implemented through dirty checking. So every digest cycle that runs, it's going to check these two values and see if they change and then return a new value if it has. I think like in Ember and Knockout use like a pub sub method where they wait for changes to happen and they broadcast them out. So these you can use these still. You can still have they're called a getter. So you can have a getter and a setter in ES6. And basically this method will return that value, but it will return it as a property. So you don't have to call for text foo as a method. You just get the value. You ask for the value of text and foo, and it'll return it from the getter. Does that make sense?
Does that change every time that foo or text change independently?
So by default, if you use this as is, this will be dirty checked. The reason why is because that is the, don't quote me on this one, so turn the recording, no, I'm kidding. Don't quote me on this one, but I believe getter methods are made to be dirty checked. So if you look at like Polymer, Meteor, anybody else that implements getters, I believe they all do it in the same way, which is using 100 millisecond, 120 millisecond dirty checking. However, we do offer, there is an easy decorator you can use to completely get rid of any dirty checking ever. There's actually a plugin where it'll go and find all your getters and it'll remove dirty checking and only use it based off a value change using the binding system. But there's also a decorator called computed from where we could just say make sure it's valid code. So we can all we'd have to do is get that decorator and we can decorate our method. And let this decorator know, watch the values of food and text, and when they change, let all my consumers, everybody who wants to know this value know that it's changed. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So you can do that too. But with the bindable decorator and with change detection like that, a lot of times I find it easier to do this. And text change or something. Where I can still have my change handler, but then logically I can place in this method call that's going to call a separate method that handles what my computer would do. And it makes this is again is a great thing for a team, because if you think of if I come behind you and you've just written this code that has a bunch of computed properties, it's really hard to read that code. It's hard to understand how does this logically flow, right? And why is this method firing before this method? It doesn't make any sense sometimes. I've dealt with it a lot. But when you actually add it into this logical flow here, where we would have this other method, we would know that after our text or food change, at the end of it, it's going to call that method. And I find that is a very refreshing change to the way that computeds work. So, makes sense? And by the way, if I get off on a tangent about something, you guys let me know. Cool. So another thing that Aurelia does really, really well is dynamic composition, right? So everybody familiar with jQuery and how you like add elements into the DOM? So I've written a lot of applications that when something changes in our table, it'll go in and add new nodes, right? And you gotta have the add node, the remove node. You got a bunch of things that are going to dynamically. They're not going to dynamically render the DOM. They're going to manually render the DOM when I tell it to. So what we use, there's a few different ways that we do it, but there's this one custom element called compose, and it's nothing special. It's just a normal custom element, just like we've looked at before. And the only job it has is to compose anything you want, and it's really nice. So you can get into. You don't ever get into a situation where your JavaScript is telling the view what to render. Your JavaScript is saying, hey, these properties change. So if you look here, anybody want to take a stab at what this is? I think it's really easy to read, so I'm going to ask it. Okay, cool. This is a repeater, right? So we're just going to repeat some logic. We're going to repeat for every item. We're going to render an item here, right? We're going to render this block. So as our items change, we'll dynamically add and remove things from the DOM, and we're going to compose them. And I'll show you more about how that works in a second. But when you look at that dynamic rendering, the really good thing is when this code changes, when this property items changes, under the covers, everything just works. It gets added to the DOM, it adds the new elements and everything else that we need it to do. We don't have to tell it to add things or remove things from the DOM. There's not in two different areas, right? It's right here that it handles all the composition. It's the separation of concerns. My view is responsible for templating. My view model is responsible for changing that representation. And with compose, it's just a custom element, like I said, where it'll go out and render another custom element based on whatever this property changes, right? So if our item has a property called type, and type is button, it would go out and it would find in our widgets folder our button custom element, and it would render it out for us. And it's this is actually a big question we get is when a lot of people come to Aurelia from other frameworks, there's a very specific way that you have to do it, and I guess this is specific too. But what's really nice is so when you want to render a bunch of different types of custom elements, so say we have 10 different templates, and we get some JSON and we want to render different custom elements based on our JSON results, we can bind it directly to the data. We don't have to do a bunch of manipulation of it and find out, go out and new up an instance of this custom element and then render it in the DOM here. We can just let our DOM take care of what it renders. Does that make sense? So everybody uses these for like questionnaires. Everybody's seen like a questionnaire. You have a different type of question, right? So your JSON represents, the JSON is the model, and it says, hey, this is what type I am. The view model's job is to pass the values into your view, and your view's job is to render it. That's the underlying principle behind MVVM.
If you could go back.
Yeah, definitely.
If items is reordered, does that change
Yes.
how, and can it just use the nodes it already has, or the nodes torn down and then re-rendered?
Great question. So the way that items is defined is this is just a standard array. There's nothing special about it. It's not, you don't have to like new up an instance of an array. So when we say items, we would just say items equals 2 square brackets, and that's it. And so whenever the value of that changes, it's going to render whatever happens to items, right? And so, so say we want to apply a sort to it. We can, just like you do in Angular or anywhere else, we can apply like a filter. We call it a value converter, but it's almost the exact same syntax. And you could do your sorting there. You could do it in your view model if you wanted. Wherever you do it, it will come back and it'll render properly. And the second question was, okay, what about that? I've actually got that element, right? There's no need to take that off the DOM and then re-render it just because I resorted it. As much as possible where we can, we always try to reuse the element. We try to cache everything, reuse it. There are some instances like if you as a developer go in and you set this to null and then you set it to the new value that's reordered, then you have to redo it, right? But as long as you follow the preferred way of clearing an array or reordering an array in JavaScript, it's just going to work. It's going to take the same. I'm trying not to use anything too specific, but under the covers, it takes that view slot and it just puts it in the new location. And we actually have a really cool plugin. It's a core plugin called UI virtualization. So if everyone familiar like with a phone, typically when you render 1 million items on a phone, it doesn't like it, right? So you try to, what you do, it's called virtualize the DOM. You try to take and only show what the consumer can see and then only leave the things in the DOM that need to be there. And you don't want the end user to know you did it, but you want it to be done, and it's a really, really hard problem to have. I think a lot of people say that Famous has a really good implementation of that virtual scroller, and so people will go and use Famous just for that reason because it's a really tough problem to solve. So we actually have a plugin that does that, and it's kind of funny because someone will go post, and the guy that's maintaining it right now, he'll go post, "Hey, I've made a change to it. Can everybody check their phones?" And we'll all grab our phone and go to the right getter page and start scrolling as fast as you can and see what happens. See what goes wrong. And generally, it works really well. Every once in a while, everybody introduces a regression bug, but it's really nice. So it's a core part of the framework is that idea of virtualizing huge lists of data, and it's done using the core system there. So, does that answer your question?
It does.
Cool. Another thing that we do is part of the view lifecycle, and this is really neat because this is influenced from the predecessor to Aurelia, and it's actually I like to think it has, even if not in official capacity. The custom element spec actually now implements these same lifecycle methods, but using I think the bind and unbind terms are different, but they're like create and something else. But anyway. These are really nice because, I don't know about you guys, but whenever you have to wait on the DOM to be ready and then do some things, it seems like you end up putting either a ton of those document ready flags around, or you end up putting a ton of stuff in one method, right? But if I'm writing a custom element, I don't care when everything else in the world is in the DOM. I only want to know when I'm there and when I can be manipulated, right? And so that's the really cool thing about custom elements, and what we do is, and React does this as well. React uses the same methods but with different names, I think. Anyway, so whenever you're added to the DOM, this method will be fired. I can put all my logic of what to do when I arrive here, and when I leave, I can put my logic there. When I'm removed from the DOM, I may have something like a lot of third-party libraries have like a dispose method where when you're done with me, kill me. And you can put that in the detached, and it's very conventional. So if we look at our button, this button idea has worked out perfect here almost. If we look at our button when we're attached, we may want to call dot drop down. Oh wait, no, that doesn't make sense. Bootstrap doesn't have a button method. So say we're building a drop-down just for giggles, right? When we're added to the DOM, we want to do some DOM manipulation, and we can put our code right there that goes out, grabs the element, makes a drop-down, and then when it leaves the DOM, we might want to say dispose. And I don't know if that actually has that method. But now my button is completely in charge of what happens to me, not to everybody else, but to me. I'm in charge of my element. And we need to get a reference to the element, which is really simple to do as well. But what's really nice about that, like I said, is this code is really easy to read. And anybody that comes behind me and wants to know why is it flickering when the item is added to the DOM, it's pretty easy to figure out out of these methods which one that code is located in, right? And then once you do, I think it's a very conventional way. No matter what you call the method, it's a very conventional way of handling the life cycle of the element. Does that make sense? I always ask if that makes sense for like validation of what I was thinking came out the way I said it. So, and by the way, those lifecycle methods up top, they're the same thing. So after I'm in the DOM, I may want to wait until the binding is completed or I'm unbinded my element before I do something. A lot of libraries, I'm trying to think. A select element. Usually you have to wait for all the options to be there before you can tell select eyes are chosen or whatever to go manipulate it. So you don't want to do it as soon as I'm there. You want to wait until I've got my data, if that makes sense. Yeah, and another thing with the attributes, like we talked about earlier, I think this is a big point. If you look at this code, this is all valid HTML. There's nothing invalid about this HTML. When we serve it up to our browser, the browser is going to leave it exactly like it is. The reason why is we don't have any capital letters, special characters, or invalid syntax here, right? And in fact, what we try to do is anything that you can put into this bind statement should be a valid JavaScript expression or literal or something like that, right? If you try to put invalid JavaScript in here, it'll throw up and tell you that you can't do that. It's not, you can't, I'm trying to think. You can't use something from CoffeeScript inside there, right? Because it's not been transpiled yet. So that's a really big point for me because if you're choosing what tool to use for your team, your team is generally going to get together and make this decision, right? Hey, what are some of the pros and cons of what we're doing? And there's always this possibility that what you choose could have bad practices built into it that everybody then learns, right? And so, not to throw anybody under the bus, but if you look at the way, what was I going to say in particular? I think it was the. I'm not going to go that way. If you look at other syntax, sometimes you can end up with invalid HTML, or you can end up with invalid expressions, and then what your developers are learning when they're learning how to use it, it doesn't help them in the future. It helps them to build what we're building now, but you learn a bad pattern, and that bad pattern can stick with you. Does that make sense? And to me, I think that's a big. It's always a big red flag when you're talking to somebody about JavaScript, or you're talking about. Just JavaScript in general, and they start to use a framework-specific concept and say, no, that's how HTML works. And you're like, oh, crap, you've learned something that's not actually true, and that's hard to unlearn. So, cool. And so, not only can you add functionality, we talked about click, right? Click is a valid event that happens on an element. That actually happens. That's part of the browser handles that click event. That's not really doing it for you. All we're doing is allowing you to say, when I click on trigger, fire this event. The same way that if you did it with vanilla JavaScript or jQuery or whatever else. But if you look here, this if and show, these are custom attributes. These aren't normal attributes of an HTML element, right? So if we set disabled on our button, that's a valid HTML attribute. If we set the if value, nothing's going to happen. But what we can do is we can create our own attributes and tell them what we want our HTML element to do, what we want our custom element to do. So like for our button, for example, say we don't want to render our button if some property on our view model is true, we can conditionally show or hide it, we can take it out of the DOM or put it back in the DOM depending on the value of that property. And so now, it's really powerful because if you look at where if and show come from, they come from Aurelia, but they're just custom attributes. they're part of the same thing that you can write or choose to use. So if we looked at, I think the example is of the show binding. When we look here, we've defined that this is a custom attribute, and obviously I've got a typo because we said show before. This is like a custom show, so that actually makes sense. But we can tell our element using whatever we want how to interact when this attribute value changes. So if the attribute value is set up front, or if the value changes of it, we can conventionally handle what happens to our element. And this is really cool. So if you look at how show actually works under the covers, this is basically all the code. I think there's a few things we've had to add for browser compatibility of class lists, i.e. 9 doesn't support the element having a class list. So class list this is just from standard JavaScript. Anyway, so this is how it actually works. All it does is it adds a new class called Aurelia hide. It adds it to or from the DOM depending on what the value of the value is, right? There's nothing special about how this works. When the value changes, it comes in and we check. If it's true, we remove it. If it's false, we hide it, right? Does that make sense? So whatever our value resolves out to is we get that value in here. And this is using I might have omitted a little bit of code where it actually defines where value is, but if you look up here where we said we're binding to the is saving property, when we toggle the value from true to false or whatever we want, that will refire our binding so that we can go in and handle it. And this would be getting into kind of that configuration, so I don't want to touch into it too much. Any questions on custom attributes? Yeah.
Real quick, where it says if bind is logged in, could you do any sort of logic in there, or do you have to create a new property if you want to have like is not logged in? I couldn't just use like a negation there. Right?
Oh no, yeah, you can.
You just put like a.
But yeah, any valid expression works. Any valid expression. So whatever you would use, you could use the double exclamation. You could put a method in here, but it's only going to be called once because methods by default don't get called multiple times, right? Okay. But if you have a property, you could do if is logged in and is not saving. We might want to show this, right? So any valid expression that you would use in your JavaScript, you can use in here.
And for the is logged in, that's a property that's passed from the parent template, right?
From the view model. So in this
view
case, this template would be rendered inside of a. So say if we looked at our button.
Do templates pass properties between each other? Like a parent template pass properties down to a child template?
That's what. Let's see.
Some part of what my confusion is, I just don't know if like is logged in is coming from the view model, if it's coming as a passed property.
Yeah, definitely. So if we looked at is logged in, whoops. This dot is log in. And we're only going to show our button if we're logged in, right? And we'll just say and true is not false. So the and is true is not false. That's valid JavaScript. You would never do it because true is never, true is never going to be equal to false, right? But it's just showing you that you can use anything that you would use in your view model, syntax-wise, an expression, is valid to use in your binding. So what will happen here? So if we look at our class for our button, what we've done is we've defined that we have an is logged in property on our view model, right? In our view, we're binding to that property. So when that property first gets set, we're giving it a default value of false, right? Does everybody see that? When we set the default value to false, now if we want to change the value to true, we would just call that method passing true, and it would toggle this property in our view model. And then when that property changes, it would reflect in the DOM. So at this point, anything that's defined on this level of our view model, or if you change it off of this, would be a valid property of this view model. Yeah. Does everybody know what I mean about just chaining properties? So like if we went into our click event and we started going rogue and just saying this dot some new property equals blue. This is now a valid property of our view model because that's what this is in JavaScript, obviously. So we can dynamically add properties. We don't want to, And the reason I say that is because the reason you follow a class syntax is so we can define where all of what all our properties are. We can give them default values, and then any consumer knows exactly what properties we have. They don't have to go searching through the code to find where we're adding it. But we can certainly do that. So that's for our button. But now our consumer. Let's start up a third window here. Tell me if it's getting too small. Let's say our consumer has a template of their own. Let's see. Consumer. Cool. So say our consumer is actually going to require our button. And then when they actually use the button, we can't use that one. That was a bad one. So button is a valid HTML element. We can't we can't steal it.
Does that throw like an error?
No, it would. So what would happen here is it would actually, it's going to ignore our button. It would say you can't define a custom element that shares the name with the standard element. It's actually a part of the spec. They're pushing for custom elements to always have a dash in them because none of the current set of elements have a dash, and so that would be their differentiation. That's the spec that Polymer is really pushing. So if it doesn't, if I haven't put this across already, with Aurelia, we try to work across with other frameworks as much as we can. So like we try to work with Polymer and using things like Flux from React, or using like reactive observables and things like that. And all those are, we don't try to like go, no, that's bad, don't use this, right? Because there's some really good things that they've done in Polymer and that they're really driving the spec, and so we want to do that as well. But I digress. So when we use our custom button, we would say, we would name our file custom button, we would require from custom button, and we would say text.bind equals food, right? And then, so now we have the custom element we already built, and we also have the consumer of that custom element. So now we want to use it all over our application. This might be another view model pair, right? That this view here would also probably have a view model that had a foo property on it, right? And so what we would say is we want to render this button, and we want to bind the value of text, which is up here. We have a binding. We want to bind that to the value of our foo. That's only going to be a one-time binding. We can go in and we can change that. So every time that foo changes, we want it to be represented in our custom element. We could say .two-way, which would enforce a two-way data binding. But by convention, when you're sharing data between a parent and a child, we always default to one way, and that's to prevent the performance issues that come with sharing data all over your application between all the components. But that's how you would consume it. Does that make sense? So when it gets down to is logged in, the property comes from the view model because we set it. But if we change it to text, we can set the value from the consumer as well, right? So if we said is logged in, is logged in. If we want
the properties to overwrite the properties on the view model.
Mm-hmm. When it gets first set, when it gets first bound to it, it will bind it to that property.
Is there a way to make properties on the view model like immutable, so you can't change them via like passing properties?
Yes. So to completely make it immutable, yes, you wouldn't use. I'm trying to think, because you can use a constant, and a JavaScript constant is just it's not real. You can't actually say don't let me change my value. But if you have it, let me double check with you, because I don't want to give an answer that's wrong, because then I'm on video giving a lie. So I'm pretty sure you can. I mean, even if you went back, if nothing else, you could always go in our text changed event and just nullify changing the value. I know that's a dirty way. I know you can do it. I'm just trying to, before I said it's enforced that way, I want to make sure that I'm not lying to you. Cool. So how are we on time? Okay. So let's touch on data binding, routing. So I've got a few more topics that we could go over, and I could talk to them really in depth. But what would be really cool is if anybody had a question specific to like a, hey, ask, we're doing data binding at work and we're running into these issues. Tell me a little bit about how Aurelia does data binding or routing or something like that. Does anybody have any questions or anything they'd like to view as like a large topic? Yeah.
You just mentioned routing. That's what I'm wondering about.
Okay, cool. So, so a cool backstory is that a lot of these conventions that you'll see in Aurelia come from a previous JavaScript framework that's it's open source, but it's owned and maintained by the same company that is over Aurelia. I say company, basically an organization that sponsors Aurelia development. And so a lot of things you see come from this other application called Durandal, and so they have deeper roots in learning from other things. So when you get into routing, you'll notice a lot of similarities to things like routing in Ember or Rails or any other anything else that constructs their routes to I don't want to say a RESTful way, but like if you have users and you have like a show page and an index, you can adopt all those conventions and it's really simple. We try to keep it as simple as possible. But the routing component is really neat because originally the Angular 2 router, the guy that worked on the Angular 2 router was actually brought on just to build out that router for one and do other things as well. But he's the one that left Angular 2 and his name is Rob Eisenberg. And he's the one that started the Aurelia push, right? So I guess he's the owner of the Durandal company. So the router has like all these really nice things that anything that you can think of you can do with the router can probably be done with the Aurelia's router. It's a really robust router. You could take it outside of the framework and reuse it, and I think it would stand up there with what's the really popular routing library now? It's not. Is it Sales do routing? I'm trying to remember.
Routing McKinnon.
There's something that's like everyone loves for routing, and I can't remember what it was, but anyway. So the routing. The way that we look at routing is, so say we're serving from localhost. We don't have an app running, but if you guys can see the URL bar, say when we visit users, we want to probably go out and get a list of users, right? So we want to set our main routes up so that we have these top level routes. But then as we get into users and we want to show our first user or something, right? So we pass a URL that says user/1. Well, we know conventionally that's probably the ID of our user, right? So when we visit this route, we want to go and find the user that's corresponding and show their data. So now there's a second level of routing that's outside of our normal routing, and we want to continue to nest these. The routing is set up so that you can configure it this way, and I highly recommend it. And I say configure it this way, so the application has a set of routes, right? If we look back at our, whoops, that's not it. If we look back here, where was our router? Cool. When we configure our router, we have a welcome route, which is the default. We have a to-dos route, and we have a details route, right? These are set up for to-dos, details, and to-dos lists. This would probably be a better child router, so this doesn't really help my example. But say we have users and we have facilities or something, right? When you build out the users, you want to go to that route and be able to show that data, but you don't want in your main router configuration, you probably don't want to configure all the user routes and define how everything has to be structured, right? You want users to be responsible for its own routing. Users is a custom element, just like we looked at. We don't want to have one route configuration for everybody. We want users to be able to define how routing should be handled within myself, if that makes sense. So if we visit, in this example, if we change the word welcome to users, When we go to user/1, we want that parameter to be passed in, and then you can take and do whatever routing you want within yourself, right? Does that make sense? So, and the reason I say that is because it's a conventional way to do it, and it makes code really easy to read and to grow. So when you do your routing, when you handle, if you have a user's route, and then you have like your show, index, maybe delete, edit, you have those sub routes in there. Now you don't have to actually go and build those all out up front. You can add them as you need them because your user's route already shows all your users, and then you can go build out from there. And it kind of, I guess it's kind of hard to put in words, but it makes your application grow more organically. So it's not like you get a requirement to go build out users. Obviously, that's going to have all the features of the users page. You're going to go ahead and put it all in place because you're configuring it. And what I'm saying is, don't do it until you need it. You know what I mean? And it allows you to build your application that way. It's also really modular, so you can. It doesn't matter where the welcome route exists. It doesn't matter where these exist. We can tell our loader where to go get them. So we can actually have the exact same module be tied to different routes, or there's any number of configuration changes that you can do. So anyway, it's kind of neat. But
Can you do content negotiation?
say it again.
Content negotiation, like what if you said you wanted JSON instead of HTML?
Mhm.
Is that handled through the routing?
So traditionally, your router would never serve up JSON, right? I'm trying to think of. So the idea. I mean, I guess you could. There's no reason you couldn't. That's a good question. You would actually
if you had user one and
Yeah.
you're asking for HTML,
Uh-huh.
then you're coming in and you're a human and you want to see it.
Mhm.
But why can't I use the same route, specify I want JSON, come in as a service and consume the same data?
Theoretically, I'm pretty sure you could set it up. I'm pretty sure you could do that. I don't think it's supported right now because typically to serve that route, you would still need a browser to open it up, understand the JavaScript, and then know what to go back and serve. So you wouldn't. I don't know that there's anything that would block you from displaying the JSON, but I don't know that your request could actually return the JSON like a service would. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because it's client side. Right?
Yeah. It's kind of. It seems like it would be. It seems okay. So that would be a really good example of how you could take and use maybe the router on a server side. So this piece of routing, the repository for routing, should be usable on the server side as well, right? There's nothing that should stop it from pointing to the right module, and then say that this is just a node module that does return JSON, and you have something like, I don't know. So it would be kind of like instead of using Express to serve the JSON, you could use the router. That might be a real possibility. That's a really good question. I never thought of it before.
Okay. What about lazy loading?
Who has lazy loading? Okay, cool. Yeah, so if you wanted to lazy load your route of actually like displaying it, or you're saying it in general, like with dependency injection, can you lazy load?
Well, you got a big app, and you don't want to load it all at the same time.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a really good question. Because lazy loading can be a bit confusing. So with a router, you would not load any of these up until they're needed. The router is actually, its job, its responsibility is when this route is visited to go find this and serve up an instance of it. If welcome's view model defines itself as something like a singleton or a transient, and then we can define how DI actually gets it. For lazy loading in general, you can do it, but the better question is, okay, I've got an app. I want my user to get on a page and see something and not have to load up everything first, right? And so it's a really cool thing. It's not even really a specific what I'm going to explain. It's with using JSPM and System.js. JSPM installs the packages for us. System.js finds it for us. It's our loader, right? And most or all of our skeletons, we suggest using System.js because when you go out to try to find the welcome route, System is really efficient at it. And unlike something like require, where you basically have to tell it everything you want it to do, with system, it's very configurable. And you can say, so we can say, so say we want to bundle up everything related to our users route, right? And then separately, we want to bundle up all of our to-dos, and separately, we want to bundle up all of our facilities. We don't have to serve all three of those bundles to the end user when they load it up. We only want to serve the one that they're going to see, right? We only want to, they're visiting the user route for the first time. Don't give them the other information. So the system is really nice because when it goes and it tries to find it, under the covers, we would say, hey, I want to bundle up all these routes together. And system would know that welcome is part of the welcome bundle. And it would go out and it would go ahead and eager load, well, it loads the whole bundle. So basically it's eager loading everything that's related to it. But we wouldn't go out and we wouldn't load everything else up. And the reason I said it's powerful is because now we've reduced the number of requests for one. Instead of having one request for 1 megabyte that has everything our application can do, we can only serve up like 300 KB, which is all the essentials needed just to show this. Now when we go to get to-dos, hey, we've already got all the framework dependencies and things like that. Don't go load them again. Just load the bundle that has everything related to to-dos in it. And it's a really nice way to progressively load your application. Yeah?
How about just the opposite? You go to the application and go one way to get some information or whatever, and want to pop over, and I pop back and forth a couple times, but then I end up on this side and running this. Does these expire and clean off for you?
So
Can you set that?
yeah, you can tell the router and you can tell DI to dispose of things. I wouldn't suggest in a normal circumstance you wouldn't want to have to manually implement garbage collection, right? Because that's what we're talking about. We want to get rid of what we're not using. So by not using things like a lot of two-way data binding and a lot of the things that can create bad practices, garbage collection will automatically go get that for you when it's not in use and it's not being used. With the relay, you can basically tell the router or DI, hey, always keep this in memory. Always cache whatever we've already seen, because when I go back to it, I don't want to show it. I don't want to reload it again.
You set those with priorities in too?
Say it again.
Can you set a priority on that? Cache X amount, and then as they start getting rid of them, start getting rid of the lower priority?
I don't know. That's a good question. I haven't thought of it from that perspective. Typically, I would think not. I don't know. That's a good question, though. Yeah.
How about async data fetching, like the to-dos example? Where would you make that AJAX request from the remote API? Is it just in the attached lifecycle part of the to-dos list?
Yeah, perfect. Look at that. So the question was, say we wanted to go load some data, but we don't actually want to show anything or render our template until we have the data, right? It's like have you guys ever loaded a page and you start seeing things flash on there and you're like, what the hell was that? And it's like the binding syntax, like why are you showing me this? I don't care. As the end user, it looks like your page is broken now. So all you'd have to do, so any lifecycle event or any router event can return a promise. And if it does, it will, if you do return a promise, it'll wait on it to fulfill. And if you don't, it'll just render it out. So say we're doing an HTTP call. I'm going to implement one real quick. And you don't have to use the Aurelia HTTP client. You could use jQuery or just write your own requests, right? But I'm going to use this for brevity. All we'd have to do is say, that's all we'd have to do. So basically we're saying the same thing as doing an AJAX. We're going to do an AJAX call. By default, anything that you use the Aurelia HTTP client for will assume that you're waiting for JSON back. Because in most modern web applications, 90-some% of the time, that's what everybody wants back is JSON, right? Very rarely do anything else. You can tell it to return something else. But anyway, when we make that get, it will go out, it'll fetch this from our server, so localhost 9,000 users, whatever, and it'll return this. So this returns a promise, just like AJAX does, just like using jQuery.ajax. When we return it, the templating engine knows to wait for that promise to fulfill. And so this attach method basically will freeze our custom element until that promise resolves. And when I say resolving a promise, if it's not clear, what happens is when this data comes back, basically our promise is then resolved, and it's going to pass the data that it fetched back into it. So in this case, we're not doing anything with the data, but normally we would chain on a dot then and say, when we get the data, do something with it. So.
And in your production applications, really, is this the preferred method, or do you guys abstract that away? Because it kind of seems kind of weird that you have your component here, it's coupled to your data layer now.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. So it depends. If you're building a component that you'd want to use on a budget, like say we have a feedback widget and we want to use it all over the place, so we don't want to necessarily have 3 or 4 services and modules that are attached, right? We just want to go get some data and we want to show it. I'd probably leave it in here because then you don't have to. It's not a big deal to go out and load the other service or whatever, but you don't have to worry about having multiple files. It's like a 1-to-1 ratio. You drop it on your page and it just works, and that would work on a static page too. But in a large application, definitely you would want to take this out into like a data layer and create a service for it or something like that.
So you guys use services, you don't have like constantly a route object or anything?
There's a few plugins that do implement some things like that, I think, and I'm not sure exactly which architecture that they're following. But when I typically do application development, especially for a production app that's going to be big, I would take this and put it into like a service that goes through like usually like a single point of contact for that set of data, if that makes sense.
And then the service would be a dependency on this component?
Mm-hmm.
Or would it be a
Yeah,
dependency
we would
on
just at the top we would say something like import user service from service, or well, I typically name them like this, and then we could just say something like that. We'd have to pass it in through DI, which is really simple.
It's a little better, but what about like a user's list component that can't be coupled to like a service like that? Maybe you have like a new users like a route that shows the users created in the last 10 minutes, and then there's a general users route that's like all the users. So depending on which route you render, you want to have a different service. How would you set that up and use the same component?
You mean you have the same view model to display multiple things?
Because it's still a user list, so you don't want to have to worry about that.
Yeah, so what you could do in that case is basically your user's page is responsible for rendering the index page, the show page, things like that, and they could all be their own custom element if you wanted them to. And that way you would reduce the total number of lines of code by putting the code where you need it. You would have smaller view models that have more defined responsibility.
Okay.
Instead, I typically try not to share. I try not to take and make a controller out of my view models, and that's probably a personal preference. But I try not to put so much logic. Once this gets off the page and I've got to scroll down to see it, I've probably got too much logic in there. That's personally how I try to treat it. So.
Okay.